and you're very welcome back to another episode of History Now. As regular viewers of the show will know, we've discussed in the past a number of aspects to do with what we call on the island of Ireland the decade of centenaries. However, there are centenary celebrations going and commemorations going on right across the world, notably in Mexico, who experienced their own revolution over the period of 1910 to 1920 and have been engaged in commemorations related to the 100th anniversary of that. So bearing that in mind, we're going to talk about the Mexican Revolution today. And joining me all the way from Arizona is Dr. Alexander Aviña, who is the Associate Professor of Latin American History in Arizona State University. Alex is joining me today to talk about the Mexican Revolution and figures in that revolution such as Emiliano Zapata and what he meant to Mexican society after the period of the revolution. So Alex, you're very welcome to the show. I'm delighted you could join me today. So Alex, to give us a bit of background on the revolution, I want to look at the main sort of key player in Mexico at the time of the revolution, and that was Porfirio Diaz. Can you tell us who he was and why in 1909, 1910, people began to mobilize against him to enact this revolution?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Barry, for having me on. This is a real honor, so thank you for inviting me. That question is a huge question, right? So I'll try to give you the really concise version. So Porfirio Diaz was a military man, right? In 19th century Mexico, he became really famous after the famous Battle of Puebla in May of 1862, when Napoleon III decided to send in his French troops into Mexico. I won't get into the why because that'll take us into a radically different direction. But this was the famous battle that then leads to the commemoration of Cinco de Mayo, or the May 5th in Mexico to this day. And Porfirio Diaz played a prominent military role in this specific battle, but also just in the broader struggle against the French intervention in Mexico in the 1860s and against the civil war between Mexican liberals and Mexican conservatives. He was on the liberal side. So he was a national hero. And when he attempts to take power, he runs for the presidency in the 1870s. He fails. He attempts to take power a couple of times. But eventually he does win presidential power through an election in 1876, or else he takes power in 1876. And he will be the main, quote unquote, strongman in Mexican politics and national life from 1876 to 1910, when the Mexican Revolution breaks out, with the exception of a brief 4-year interlude from 1880 to 1884, when his friend will be technically the president of Mexico. So throughout those 3+ decades, Porfirio Diaz will be the strongman of Mexico. You'll still have pro forma presidential elections every 4 years. There's still a functioning judiciary. There's still a Congress. But for all intents and purposes, he is like the dictator of Mexico. And depending on your political perspective, he's either seen as like the great modernizer of Mexico, right? He's the one who finally unified a country that had been racked by internal strife since its independence in the early 19th century from Spain. He's the one who brought in foreign capital. He's the one who helped court foreign capital, which then, did things like lay railway tracks and telegraph and quote unquote modernize the country and brought it into the 20th century. And that's generally how he was viewed internationally and by the elites, right? Like Mexico averaged somewhere between 6 to 8% GDP growth in the 1880s, 90s, up until the financial crisis of 1907. So he was celebrated globally, right, as this great statesman. But to accomplish all of this required massive amounts of repression of the vast majority of Mexicans, which in that point were peasants, right? Peasant villagers who had lived in communal lands, depending on what part of the country. They had occupied these lands for centuries in some cases. And the economic model, this capitalist modernization program that Porfirio Diaz helped create, required a certain level of violence and political authoritarianism to enable things like the plundering of peasant lands to accommodate the economic demands and desires of the planter elite class, or the taking away of peasant lands to build railway tracks. So really, so even while internationally Porfirio Diaz is seen as like this great statesman and modernizer, from below, peasants are seeing the consequences of this particular governance model as entailing the disappearance of their communally owned lands and the disappearance of any semblance of local democracy or autonomy vis-a-vis this authoritarian centralized state. And this is why you have the emergence of the 20th century's first great peasant social revolution in 1910, which is the Mexican Revolution. It was a peasant social revolution that in many ways fought and organized to prevent their disappearance, which was already happening in certain regions of the country, and that Porfirio Diaz had been supporting with his courting of foreign capital. And one of the interesting things that Porfirio Diaz does is that he's really good at balancing like US capital with European capital, because he knew that US capital, because of its geographic location, could dominate the Mexican economy. So he was a wily old guy in terms of how to balance off foreign capitalists and having them compete against one another. And he also was really good at managing, buying off, co-opting local leaders and regional leaders to follow his model. And if you didn't go along with it, you could face deportation to the most inhospitable haciendas regions of the country. There were several indigenous rebellions that he brutally suppressed with the federal army with the help of railways. You had entire indigenous populations from the north of Mexico deported to southern Mexico. You also had a Mayan rebellion in the south of Mexico that was brutally crushed, and some of those survivors and prisoners were then sent to Cuba and sold as slaves. So, and a lot of this the classic work on this that describes like plantation hacienda conditions was Kenneth Turner's Barbarous Mexico, which is like an old journalistic account of this that is a pretty interesting reading.
So it's quite clear that there were a number of different factions, different parts of the country, people with different affiliations who had issues with Diaz. So can you tell us a bit about one of them, and that is Emiliano Zapata, who he was and how he came to be a part of the revolution?
So Zapata is a really interesting figure that I continue to be obsessed with, and I probably will always be obsessed with. Like, I grew up in my house. My parents are Mexican. They were born in Mexico, and our house was filled with stories of Zapata. Very popular renditions of his history. Zapata was I would say like a middling peasant in the southern state, south central state of Morelos, right? So Morelos is immediately south of Mexico City. He comes from a long line of, both on the maternal and paternal side, of rebels. Like, he had, both sides of his family had participated in the Mexican independence wars of the 1810s. They fought against the conservatives. They fought against the French invaders. I think some of them even had fought against the Americans during the Mexican-American War, the mid-19th century. But he wasn't necessarily a poor peasant. Like, his parents had left him a small plot of land in this village called Anenecuilco. And Anenecuilco is a village that could trace its existence to more than 700 years. A small village, about 400 to 500 people. And in that village, Zapata and his family names of Zapata and the maternal of Salazar were really highly respected. Right? So he wasn't well off, but he wasn't like the worst off. Like, he wasn't going to work on a hacienda or plantation as a day laborer. He had a small plot of land. He started engaging in dealing livestock. And he was also famous regionally for being the best horse trainer around, to the point where on the eve of the Mexican Revolution, he gets drafted into the Mexican military against his will. And what gets him out of that was a really wealthy Mexico City baron intercedes on his behalf and brings him to Mexico City to work in his stables, right, as a horse trainer. So Zapata then, so he comes from this long family line of rebels, and on the eve of revolution, so 1908, 1909, he gets it. I'll put it this way. Porfirio Diaz gives a really famous interview to an American journalist in 1908 in which he says, look, I'm not going to run for re-election in 1910. It's time for someone else to take the lead. Mexicans are ready for, quote unquote, ready for democracy. And this unleashes a flurry of opposition political activity and organizing on the ground in most parts of Mexico. And in the state of Morelos, this led to a lot of small-scale organizing on the ground, and Zapata participated prominently in the opposition political campaign for the person who was running for governor of the state, which peasant communities viewed as an extremely important, urgent task, because the candidate who Diaz had appointed, Pablo Escandon, was a sugar baron, was a sugar planter, and this marked the first time in the history of Morelos in which a sugar baron was going to directly rule politically. The sugar barons had controlled the state for about 3 decades. They had led a broader enclosure movement throughout the state in which their haciendas, their sugar producing haciendas, were expanding and swallowing up water resources, forestry resources, and most importantly, swallowing up the lands owned by free peasant villages like Zapata's village of Enequilco, right? So they were literally disappearing before these rapidly encroaching sugar plantations, which were amongst the most modern in the Americas in terms of sugar mill technology, railway tracks, and et cetera. So Zapata gets engaged in this opposition political campaign, and they lose, and they face a lot of repression because once Diaz nationally gave that interview, he pretty much realized what he had done. And what he had done was reveal that there was a split within the Mexican elite class, and people at the bottom were able to perceive that split. And you had, over the course of 3 decades, a process of plunder and pillage in which 90% of Mexican peasant villages had lost their land. So Zapata begins locally. They lose this opposition political candidacy for the gubernatorial elections. And by 1910, they take a different tack. And essentially what these villages start to do is they start to organize themselves and start to try to arm themselves to push back encroaching sugar plantations that would simply go into a peasant village and set up fences around that land and then sow it with sugar. Now this could have just continued to be like some sort of local peasant, the way that the people of Mexico City would call it. This was a bandit, right? Like armed bandits are preventing haciendas from engaging in economic production. But then at the end of 1910, you have a really important movement in which a prominent national opposition political figure, Francisco Madero, calls for a national revolution on November 20th, 1910, against Porfirio Diaz's dictatorship. Nothing really breaks out until early 1911, and what you have is a disparate set of localized rebellions in places like Morelos and in the north of Mexico, particularly in the state of Chihuahua, where you have these armed groups of peasants who, in the state of Morelos, what they start to do is they start to tear down hacienda or plantation fences, and they start to reclaim their land, armed, and preventing any sort of hacienda security forces from taking back that land. And Zapata becomes a prominent leader, and becomes a prominent leader because his own village of Enequilco elected him village president in 1909 because they, quote unquote, wanted a man with his pants on, like they wanted a brave young warrior to defend the village. And what he starts to do is starts to organize all the local villages around that area. And by 1911, he finds himself, because of his local support, local charisma, because people could trust him, because people cared about him and liked him, he found himself at the head of a growing peasant rebellion that was also occurring at the same time that nationally you have a broader peasant rebellion brewing against the Porfirio Diaz dictatorship. So by the middle of 1911, Francisco Madero's forces, mostly located in the north, led by people like the famous Pancho Villa, the other famous peasant revolutionary, they've managed to defeat the federal army in a series of important battles. At the same time, in the south, Zapata's rapidly growing armed league of peasant villages, as historian John Womack characterizes them, have managed to capture the state capital of Morelos. So by May of 1911, Porfirio Diaz is suing for peace, and soon he's going to find himself on a ship on his way to Europe for exile. And Francisco Madero, who now in Mexico is remembered as like the martyr of Mexican democracy, will essentially take over and win presidential elections at the end of 1911.
There are many aspects of the Mexican Revolution which are hugely interesting, and you've mentioned Pancho Villa there. I'm sure we could talk for an hour on him alone and his march into Mexico with Emiliano Zapata. But I'd like to bypass that somewhat and just focus on something that's called the Plan of Ayala. And that was a manifesto penned by Emiliano Zapata. Can you tell us what the Plan of Ayala was and why that was so important and continues to be so important in relation to Mexican politics?
Once Madero takes over, seemingly the Mexican Revolution, from the perspective of political elites, it was over, right? Because what they wanted was political transfer of power, and that's it. They wanted the dictator gone. But what Zapata represented was a social revolution. And him and Madero will have a falling out over the question of land and the return of lands to peasants. And crucially, Madero wanted the armed peasantry to disarm. And Zapata refused to do so. 1911, 1912, they have a falling out. And in response to Mexico City newspaper reports of Zapata and his forces being bandits, Zapata was famously called the Attila of the South. They were described in really disparaging ways in the newspaper. Zapata, with the help of a local school teacher and supporter, Otilio Montaño, penned the famous Plan of Ayala, which becomes a manifesto for the Zapatista Revolutionary Army in the South until 1920, when they formally put it to one side and they joined another revolutionary force. And this was after Zapata had been assassinated. And the Plan of Ayala essentially contains all the reasons why the Zapatistas were fighting, why Zapata and his forces were fighting. It's a really interesting document. The most interesting part of the document, well, a couple of things. One is its historical sense. It's almost all of its historical reference are in the 19th century. It's talking about the independence heroes. It's talking about Benito Juarez, right, this indigenous president of Mexico in the 1850s and 60s. It's talking about the Porfirio Diaz dictatorship as a betrayal of Mexico and how they're fighting to regain their lands and plundered lands that were a consequence of Porfirio Diaz's dictatorship. The important thing of the Plan of Ayala is that Zapata, for the next 9 years, Zapata would only ally himself with other revolutionary forces that promised to abide by the Plan of Ayala. And the Plan of Ayala essentially calls for, there's all sorts of stipulations, but fundamentally what this plan calls for is the return of plundered village communal lands, the nationalization of lands belonging to quote unquote the enemies of the revolution, which essentially are the landed elites that provided the economic base and political support for the Porfirio Diaz dictatorship. And it calls for local democracy, which becomes expressed to a certain sense as a form of local patriarchal democracy. And that's the famous slogan that is associated with Zapata now, right? Tierra y libertad, land and liberty, is kind of like the shorthand way to describe what the core, what the essence of this revolutionary manifesto was, even though that slogan was actually coined by Mexican anarcho-syndicalists, but then later will become adopted by Zapatistas. So essentially the way I understand the Plan of Ayala, it's calling for the return of plundered communal lands, the nationalization of lands belonging to the enemies of the revolution, and the reinstatement of local autonomy, local patriarchal democracy. And that's what they will fight for the next 9 years until Zapata is assassinated.
A really fascinating aspect of this revolutionary period is that, in my reading of it, is that most of the key players who you've mentioned there all die within the revolutionary period. So with that in mind, I would just like to talk about the assassination of Emiliano Zapata and what we could call his afterlife, because it seems that he takes on this status of an icon after his death, in much the way of Che Guevara later on, and has this really important afterlife. It seems he's a much more important figure in death than perhaps he was in life.
Yes, totally. I mean, I think Zapata and Villa will represent the most radical, the peasant parts of the broader Mexican revolutionary process from 1910 to 1920. And Zapata, because he never betrayed his principles, right? He never sold out. He never was co-opted, even though different revolutionary leaders from Madero to his successor Carranza, right? These guys who were landed elites, but were still fighting in this revolutionary process. He never succumbed to the temptation of corruption or co-optation. And he fought till the very end for the principles of the Plan of Ayala. And to a certain extent, I think that's what explains how he's persisted in 20 to 21st century Mexican history, right? Like he's assassinated in an ambush on April 10th, 1919. An army colonel fighting with Venustiano Carranza, who at that point was the main rival to Zapata. He tricks Zapata into thinking that he's going to switch forces and join Zapata. When Zapata goes to meet him on April 10th, 1919, at an hacienda, which coincidentally was one of the first haciendas that Zapata had managed to take over in 1911. Zapata rides in on his horse, a horse that was given to him by this this colonel that was supposed to join forces with him. There's some sort of honor guard. There's 3 bugles, horn, and all the soldiers there essentially just train their guns on Zapata and execute him. They assassinate him. And there's this whole afterlife to this specific assassination where this Colonel Jesus Guajardo, will take his body to the nearest big city of Cuautla, and they'll photograph the body They even have, they do this elaborate funeral for Zapata. They even record the funeral with movie cameras. And it's all done so Zapata's rivals and enemies can show the local population, look, this guy is dead. If Zapata is dead, then Zapatismo is dead. And there's a famous newspaper headline from Mexico City newspaper that said it in those terms. The headline is, Zapata has died, Zapatismo has died. So this was a way to kind of break, an attempt to break the local spirit of resistance of these rebels that had followed Zapata for nearly 10 years, and it failed. And to a certain extent, efforts to co-opt the memory of Zapata have similarly failed. He remains a radical metonym for revolution, for popular resistance, for things like direct democracy, and really this idea that those who work should enjoy or should be able to enjoy the fruits of that work, right? They should be able to control the means of that work, the products of that work. So it's interesting. So that effort immediately after assassination failed, and all subsequent efforts by the post-revolutionary Mexican state to co-opt his image, I think failed, because what ends up happening is you have multiple Zapatas. You'll have an elite Zapata that is beholden, this image that is beholden to the dictates of a post-revolutionary state that will become dictatorial and will rule until 2000, the year 2000. But then there's always like these subversive Zapatas, right? This idea that Zapata never died, the idea that his ideals of land and liberty and revolution continue to persist. And the image of Zapata becomes almost like a double-edged sword for the people who killed him and then go on to rule Mexico for decades. They want to use his image because he represents something so powerful. But at the same time, they keep reminding the people of Mexico, particularly in the countryside, that there are other possibilities and radical alternatives to reorganize both local and political life. And you have all these rebels in post-1940 Mexico that will in some way try to use and deploy the imagery and the ideas and the principles of Zapata to gain support for their own revolutionary movements.
So what fascinating is that, you know, I see images of Zapata being used right up, you know, into the period which you cover in your book, Spectres of Revolution. But I'd like to take it on a bit further to the end of the 20th century, January the 1st, 1994, where there was an uprising by a guerrilla movement who called themselves the Zapatistas in Chiapas. And it kind of caught the imagination of the world, but also caught the world unawares, I think. Could you tell us about that revolution and the importance of Zapata to that? Because it's, in one form or another, it's going on right up until the present day.
Yeah, so to complicate this a bit, so we still have Zapatistas in Mexico to this day, right? And what you referred to in your question, right, and in my comment, are these, the EZLN, the National Liberation Zapatista. I always get it wrong in English. The EZLN in Spanish, El Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, right? These indigenous guerrilla fighters who you know, exploded onto the national and international scene on January 1st, 1994, when they attempted to take over various cities in the southern Mexican state of Chiapas, right? And they're very consciously using the imagery of Zapata as the symbol for their revolution, right? It's a radically different revolution in the sense that this is a revolution since 1994 that has consciously defined itself as an indigenous revolution. It's an indigenous movement, along with being a Zapatista revolutionary movement. Whereas the original Zapatistas in Zapata, they didn't really vindicate that part of their identity, right? Whereas in Chiapas, where you have an assortment of different indigenous groups that are generally like thrown into this umbrella term that we use, right, which is Maya. But there's all these different indigenous groups. And many of these groups actually fueled this guerrilla army that emerges in 1994, but it's a guerrilla army that does less. I mean, it fights obviously, and there's 10 days of warfare. But one of the reasons why this guerrilla army, the EZLN, managed to capture international attention is because they could do other things as well, and they could write, they could articulate these really radical ideas, and gain and make connections to people way beyond the confines of their southern state of Chiapas, and even way beyond the borders and confines of Mexico, right? It helped that they had a pretty eloquent, charismatic spokesperson, the famous Subcomandante Marcos, whose name is now Subcomandante Galeano, I think. And the imagery of Zapata becomes almost indigenized in this movement. But if you read their writings, and if you read Marcos's writings, it's this idea that revolution went underground after the death of Zapata. But those ideas of rebellion and dignity and rage and all these other things that fuel resistance, they went underground. And the way that Marcos puts it in a really famous writing from the early 90s is that it's the wind, right? The wind is whispering rebellion. The wind is whispering the name of Zapata. And this movement uses that symbol. I mean, Zapata also becomes a symbol of national sovereignty, right? A different form of national sovereignty as imagined by the masses of Mexico, not the elites, who in the early 90s were too busy negotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement with the Americans, right? So you have this really crazy scene in the early 90s where the president of Mexico, Salinas de Gortari, is announcing the end to, the official end to agrarian reform as it's encapsulated in the Mexican Constitution, and the privatization of lands, right? The very same thing that had essentially caused the Mexican Revolution in 1910 is going to be done again. Except this guy then uses the symbol of Zapata to legitimize what he's trying to do. So we even have like a neoliberal deployment of Zapata, which is also crazy. And then 2 years later, these indigenous rebels, the most oppressed, the people who suffer economically the most in Mexico, who suffer racism, who suffer what Marcos referred to as the long night of 500 years, right? Because they trace the beginnings of their resistance of 1492. They explode onto the scene and they make this attempt to move the conscience of a nation. And in the process, they became internationally renowned. And they're still around to this day, right? Like they're one of these few guerrilla movements in Latin America that has managed to reproduce themselves generationally. And they control various municipalities and autonomous zones in Chiapas where they live according to their own principles, right? Egalitarian, horizontal forms of interacting with one another, but they're still under attack by outside paramilitary forces and by state forces as well.
So can we talk about the vision, the image of Emiliano Zapata today in present day Mexico? He seems to be in a lot of places you can find him. Is he as important a figure in Mexican politics and Mexican life today as he was in 1910 to 1920?
Yeah, I think its figure is always going to be important. I think there's always going to be a contest, right? There's always going to be a discursive and political contest over Zapata. So we always have to be careful to see who's deploying the image of Zapata and for what purposes. Right, in the state of Morelos in 2019, you had a very charismatic local Nahua indigenous leader, Samir Flores, who was assassinated for resisting economic development programs that would have despoiled indigenous communities of their lands, right? And the people who may or may not have been responsible for assassinations were just as liable to use the image of Zapata to kind of justify that action, as Samir was using the image of Zapata to kind of give voice and give political power to his movement, his indigenous movement in the state of Morelos that exists to this day. The current president of Mexico does this thing where he tries to, the way he connects historical figures from the revolution together is interesting, right? Because on the one, he'll put Madero and Zapata alongside one another, when in reality they ended up becoming like enemies to the death, right? Like Zapata said, if I ever capture Madero, I'm going to take Mexico City, I'm going to capture Madero, and I'm going to hang him from the highest tree on Chapultepec Hill. Like there was once they broke, they broke. And it's interesting how since then, different political leaders and factions in Mexico have tried to put them alongside one another as if they somehow fit. And people like brave activists like Samir Flores, who gave his life for his political activism, are still around to this day to remind us of who the most radical Zapata was and is, right? And why his ideas continue to resonate with so many people in Mexico. And again, because the conditions are still there. The conditions have not been resolved, and there's still a need for a Zapata in Mexico today.
Dr. Alexander Aviña, thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.